Welcome to everyone. I am Mimi Herman with AWP's Board of Directors. We are delighted to have you here in San Antonio and to bring this extraordinary event to you today in partnership with in partnership with, it's an important press, say it correctly, Red Hen Press. Please help me extend a warm welcome and thank you to Red Hen Press for their support in bringing these great literary presenters to the conference. Before we start, here are a few housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there is no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. And please give the authors about 15 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. We also ask at the conference that you respect your fellow conferees and make sure that we wash hands, find alternative handshakes, all that sort of stuff to be really safe. We are feeling really safe right now and we want to continue to do so. Lastly and most importantly, we ask that you please be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. If you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 210-664-2062. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you, and now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Kristen Young in conversation with Aimee Liu and Ellen Meeropol. Thank you very much. Please give them a round.
Hello, my name is Kristen Young, and I'm the author of the forthcoming novel, Subduction. We find solace, community, and strength through reading and writing, and I'm grateful to AWP for bringing us together for this conversation sponsored by Red Hen Press. While I'm at it, I want to thank Kate Gale, Mark Cull, Toby Harper, Monica Fernandez, Tansika Sangmarnivong, and the rest of the Red Hen Press family whose constant, tireless, and cheerful work gathered us into this room and onto the live stream. Welcome to our audience in the ether. Thank you for being here. Nonprofit indie presses try to make the world what James Baldwin called a more human dwelling place. And you know, I love their West Coast vibe. Today, Red Hen Press authors Aimee Liu, Ellen Meeropol, and I will discuss the importance, impact, and necessity of confronting family separation through literature. Although I did not know it at the time, I and these fellow novelists were writing toward the same wound, families sundered by history. As women, as writers, we have labored long to reach this day when we can, with the work of our minds, make culture. Though conditioned by forces beyond individual control, we are nonetheless tasked with healing the rupture. And this is especially the moment when we must band together to heal the rupture. Fiction acts as a portal to the mind, creating between readers and writers a community of thought. And I believe that the strength, resilience, and power of that community is critical to our future as a society and as a nation. The America of today is filled with anxiety, fear, and dread, but so much still connects us, not the least a shared faith in family bonds and the power of stories to save us. Our conversation will begin with readings from Glorious Boy by Aimee Liu and Her Sister's Tattoo by Ellen Meeropol and Subduction by yours truly. Before we begin, I'd like to share a bit of background about Aimee and Ellen, women who have written toward that wound for decades, and by so doing, invoked a kind of healing, first in the self, through the act of writing, and then in community, through the thoughts of their readers. Aimee Liu is the author of the forthcoming novel, Glorious Boy, as well as Flash House, Cloud Mountain, and Fire, and the memoirs Gaining, The Truth About Life After Eating Disorders, and Solitaire. Her books have been translated into more than a dozen languages, published as a Literary Guild super release, and serialized in Good Housekeeping. She's received a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award and special mention by the Pushcart Prize. Liu holds an MFA from Bennington College and teaches in Goddard College's creative writing program. Ellen Meeropol is the author of the forthcoming novel, Her Sister's Tattoo, as well as Kinship of Clover, selected as a Women's National Book Association Great Group Read, On Hurricane Island, a semifinalist for the Massachusetts Book Award, and House Arrest. Her essays have appeared in the Boston Globe, The Writer, and Guernica. A founding member of the Straw Dog Writers Guild, Ellen leads their social justice writing project. Each of our novels maps the path of families torn apart by history and war. Together, we chronicle quests to find lost sisters and sons, each story an affirmation of the strength of family against the unforeseen obstacles of life, of which there are so many. We regret that Donna Hemans, author of Tea by the Sea, was not able to join us for today's conversation, but I encourage you to find her lyric novel at Red Hen Press booth 1455, where Ellen, Aimee, and I will be signing our books later today, soon after the panel. And because I am a Latina and I like to model taking up space, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Again, I'm Kristen Young, currently serving as a prose writer in residence at Hugo House. I'm an investigative reporter, book critic, and essayist. My work appears in the Washington Post, The Guardian, and the New York Times, where I was part of the Pulitzer-winning team behind Snowfall. For now, an opening question, to which we will each respond with a 5-minute reading. Our novels confront family separation. What is the importance of sharing these stories, along with the impact that they have on our lives right now? After the readings, we'll spend about 30 minutes in conversation before opening up the discussion to the audience, seeking your question around 1 p.m. For those of you who are listening online, please check the Red Hen Press Twitter feed and offer some questions to them via that if you feel compelled to do so. And please give a warm welcome to Aimee Liu, who will begin our conversation with a reading from Glorious Boy.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So, Glorious Boy takes place in the World War II era, very far from today's politics, and yet there are definitely parallels. And I think one of my responses to the question of why these stories are so important to tell is that the family stories really are the containers of the deepest wounds of war, I think. And often they are untold stories because they get covered over by the geopolitics, the battle lore, the military lore. And often at the heart of these stories, of course, are women and children who have the smallest voices in this larger tapestry. So Glorious Boy takes place in 1942, and it opens on the Andaman Islands, which were the islands that were the furthest west that the Japanese occupied. And the family that's at stake in this story is an American anthropologist and her British doctor husband and their 4-year-old son, who's mysteriously mute and a difficult child, and the local girl who cares for him and loves him very much. And on the eve of occupation, in the midst of the chaos of evacuation, the 2 children disappear. And in the wake of their disappearance, the father makes the unspeakable decision to force his wife onto the ship, and she is by force, and only by force, sent to Calcutta, where she subsequently discovers that the Japanese have occupied the island where her husband and her child remain. In this quick reading, she doesn't yet know that the Japanese have arrived, but she still is in shock over the separation, the forced separation. Just keep him out of the way. Claire stares into the stifling darkness and girds herself for another day of waiting. She can't afford to keep turning back. She can't stop. Her only defense is to focus on her immediate surroundings, mourning at the Fairhaven. It stinks. It clatters. It blooms with the sour reek of dread. Beyond these walls, she can feel Calcutta opening like a boil. She pushes herself up and out from under the mosquito net. Through the blackout curtains comes the pump squeak from the courtyard behind the hotel. Boys below her window shout and splash. Temple music whines in the distance. She shoves the drapes aside and stands before a spire and a dome, their black silhouettes hard against the gunmetal sky. dung smoke and lead, the rev of two-stroke engines. Only the morning's liquid texture hints at the nearness of water, and that only the river. For all the city's turbulence, it's the missing pulse of ocean that disorients her, almost as much as her missing family. Phantom limb, her husband Shep would call it. But then she catches the reassuring smells of boiled milk and toast. The low murmur of kitchen staff drifts, along with intermittent harangues. Carry on, carry on. Claire's room is so small that to dress, she has to climb over luggage and bang into boxes of her ethnographic field notes and artifacts serves her right. All that effort, that study of the lost tribes, 5 years, the nerve of her, as if words could save her own family, let alone a whole doomed tribe. She catches herself on the end of the bed and reels back into the vortex of waking on the ship 4 days ago, the cabin whirling, the smell of machine oil and disinfectant, and a small, swarthy man in uniform peering down at her as if into a cage. She was still drugged. The wire he handed her didn't compute. Your son found A-OK. Stop. Even now, the relief Shep was sending feels dubious and painful. She rubs the bruises on her forearms where the MPs had to restrain her. But she tells herself this will all be over by the time the bruises heal. A few more days, just as soon as the next ship brings them across, life can resume. She'll fumble for redemption then. If only those last unforgivable moments would stop repeating. The children blinking, those quizzical frowns, Nyla's blouse, the color of love. They were only doing as Claire asked. Just keep him out of the way, she said to Nyla, the girl taking care of him. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I wasn't myself. So much to do and no more time. I wasn't thinking. I meant for her to keep Ty safe so he wouldn't be stepped on, wouldn't fall or hurt himself. The excuses stream, but the words she actually uttered hang her. Just keep him out of the way. The two of them stepped with such excruciating obedience over the maze of objects on her floor, objects that spoke to a devotion and people she prized over her own son. Is that true? Or is it simply a story she's telling to punish herself? Her memories grow more treacherous. She can still feel the gouge in her chest where her son punched her with the arrowhead as they were wrestling before she told them to leave. When she glanced up and the children were gone, did she give them a second thought? Worse, did she breathe relief? Thank you.
Kristen asks such an important question. Why write fiction about family separation? Because our world is broken, and family separation is a powerful, emotional symbol of the hate and the greed. Because facts don't seem to be enough to make the changes that need to be made. Is imagination enough? Are our characters and our stories enough to help us imagine a world less battered by bigotry? In her sister's tattoo, I wanted to look at our urge for social justice, to explore how much we risk when we try to change the world. I wanted to understand the personal consequences of those risks, the choice, the costs of our dissent. Like many activists, my characters are caught up in the court system, and they face impossible choices. Choices between loyalty to family, allegiance to the truth, and their commitment to social justice. The main characters, Rosa and Esther, are sisters in their early 20s. When the novel opens, they are marching through downtown Detroit in August 1968 with their shared best friend, Maggie, protesting the war in Vietnam. They hear that mounted police are beating protesters a few blocks away, and they hurry to help. Instead, they escalate the violence, and they are arrested. The sisters' response to their arrest and to the trumped-up charges are very different. Rosa sees the arrest as a further opportunity to protest an unacceptable war. Esther wants to stay out of prison, to stay home and take care of her infant daughter. In order to do that, she accepts a plea bargain, which means she must testify against her sister. Once very close, they are separated by their choices. Esther and her family are banished from their activist community. Rosa ends up in prison. Her daughter, Emma, lives with her father, Rosa's boyfriend. The sisters' political choices profoundly impact their close sibling relationship, but the consequences persist into the next generation, passed on to their daughters. In this short excerpt, Emma is 3 years old. She and her father, Alan, are visiting Rosa in prison. If Rosa could get through the first hug, she usually did okay. But some days, she couldn't bear the heaviness in her arms, so profoundly missing from her days. On some visits, that weight evoked a half moan, a small sob. Despite her best efforts at self-control, visits could be excruciating in their sweetness. Alan claimed he could tell by the first few minutes how difficult it would be. "Be strong for Emma," he whispered as he hugged Rosa on those precarious Sundays. Each visitor was allowed one embrace at the beginning of the visit and another to say goodbye. That was the rule, although some guards were more lenient with kids. Rosa heard that California prisons were so lax that the visiting rooms stank of semen. But in northern Michigan, a prisoner never touched flesh or money, never crossed the red line, never used the vending machine, never ever left the line of sight of the guards. Rosa could live with the rules, but sometimes it was almost more than she could endure to cuddle with Emma, to lean for a moment against Alan's bulk, shoulders speaking everything that tongues and breasts yearned to say. Alan touched her hand briefly under the table. "Good news today," he said. "Maggie took a job as camp nurse at Loon Lake. She can bring Emma with her." "They'll let her do that, even though Emma's not her kid?" "An exception for you." "Play with me, Mama." Emma put both hands on Rosa's cheeks, pulling her mother's face close to her own. Rosa blew a raspberry into Emma's neck, making her laugh. "Cat's cradle?" "Me first." Emma pulled a long string from the front pocket of her pink backpack. She looped it around her fingers and constructed the cradle. Rosa's throat swelled and ached. Emma at her camp. That was amazing. She turned to Alan. "Camp pays peanuts. How can Maggie swing it?" Emma squirmed sideways on Rosa's lap, held the cradle out for her mother. "Your turn." Rosa grasped the crossed strings between thumbs and pointer fingers, then pulled them apart, under and up through the middle of the cradle. "Soldier's bed," Emma announced. "Why is it called that?" "Because it looks like a cross on a coffin." Alan turned to Rosa. "Maggie's been working graveyard shift and saving the differential. I'll make up the difference in salary. It's worth every penny. Emma will love it." "I love it." "Your turn, Emma." With a flourish, the girl lifted the cross strings, pulled them up and away from the center, and scooped under the side, to make the candles. Maggie says she'll do this until Emma's old enough to be a regular camper, Alan said. Thank her for me, okay? Rosa configured the manger. Emma fumbled with the narrow triangles and tangled the strings. I can't do this. Emma's bottom lip quivered. It's too hard. Alan unwound the string from Emma's fingers. It's okay, let's play something else. Magic markers? Let's try again. Rosa pried open his fist and remade the cradle. You can do it. Emma looked at the string, then at the markers. She leaned back against Rosa's chest and stuck her fingers in her mouth. Rosa buried her face in Emma's hair, sniffed the spicy scent of her daughter's scalp. Emma would be more than halfway grown when she got out. Thank you.
So, my novel, Subduction, is a lyric retelling of the troubled history of encounter in the Americas. And I used an epigraph from Baldwin, whose essay, The Creative Process, has really bolstered me throughout the long journey of bringing this book to its readers. And in that essay, he wrote that if we understood ourselves better, perhaps we would damage ourselves less. But the truth about ourselves is always at variance with what we wish to believe. And the effort of the artist is to bring a reconciliation into those two truths, the truth that we believe about ourselves and the truth of the face that we wear. In this scene, the opening pages of Subduction, a Latina anthropologist makes her way to the reservation where she will study and engage with and disrupt a Native family. The shore pulled away. Froth churned from its feet to hers. The engines hummed through her bones. From the aft deck, Claudia looked back toward the city they made home. She searched the skyline for places they had been happy, the top of the Space Needle, a waterfront park, the Ferris wheel, until her westward passage split the horizon into expanses of gray, demarcated into sea and sky by hue alone. Puget Sound opened in fathoms below the ferry. Now, Claudia left town without saying her goodbyes. Seattle was a small world. Movers must have swarmed the house to clear out Andrew's belonging in the space of one morning. The neighbors would have seen. What had they seen? She couldn't bring herself to ask whether her sister had been on site to supervise, and Claudia hid her phone in case someone felt like sending unsolicited glimpses of Maria deciding what to take, practicing wifeliness, slipping Andrew a kiss for courage as the first box was packed. Claudia pictured Maria's thick curls, her narrow shoulders, her rounded hips, birthing hips, they'd been told. The broadcaster's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, cautioning passengers about unknown items and suspicious activities. It was cowardly of Andrew not to deliver the news in person. Worse still, Maria. Did they think that Claudia would handle it poorly, that she was dangerous? Listening to the roar of the props, Claudia saw what her fate might have been, her body lying in the bathtub, blue and bloated, afloat. Her stomach twisted. It was more than she could take or forgive. They knew what they were doing, she thought, yet they think I deserve it. Gulls swept the boat's wake. She was surprised by how close they came, how she could see feathers tracing their sinuous curves, how they were suddenly beautiful, not the splattering scavengers they had been, but flight itself. Right now, everyone I know is stuck at a desk, and then there's me, Claudia thought, on my way back into the field. As a child in Mexico, she wanted to go somewhere, anywhere, away. She had always studied people. She never envisioned herself as an anthropologist, preferring something more dashing, like explorer. But here she was, en route to the Macaw Reservation at Nia Bay, an old whaling village on the northwest tip of the lower 48. Last year, she noticed Andrew timing her periods, his prick vanishing 10 days after she first bled, which was almost funny, because lately, she found herself wanting to be careless, to chance it. Folding up her body on her side of the bed, ovulating alone whenever she could manage it, she had made it through her 30s unscathed, and that was when they were still trying. And now she thought, I'm old. I'd have a baby with Downs if I could have one at all. I just wanted something from myself, still do, something bigger for myself, bigger than myself, bigger than all of this. I don't know how to get it without wanting it. Why couldn't he understand? Besides, what kind of man fucks his wife's sister? Claudia tilted her head to consider the inverse. What kind of wife would allow her husband to become so close to her sister that he could fall for her, fall inside of her, fill her up? Only a conniver would wrap her legs around her brother-in-law. Maria's legs were curvy, great gams, Edry once said. In horror of excess flesh, Claudia carved herself to gristle. Maria's thighs bloomed. Claudia imagined they would shake in sweaty reverberation during sex, a shuddering and prayerful response to the call of loin striking flank, so unlike the flat slap of muscle her own lovemaking had become. Last month, when her fingers crept between buttons to his curly nest, Andrew's hand rose to still Claudia's wayward progress. She left her arm on top of him, trying to act natural, like this was cuddling. They pretended to sleep. It took 10 minutes to amass the strength to roll onto her back and concede. It was terrible to be uneasy in her own bed. She hadn't felt that way since college. But this time, it was her husband, and having had his love and lost it made her physically ill, a malaise so invasive it was as though she were at altitude, her body shutting down extremities, fingertips first. Sign the papers. Be done with it. He wants out. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we're going to have questions from the audience and from the ether in about 20-25 minutes. But I wanted to call out to a writer that I have admired for so long, Maxine Hong Kingston, who says that the present affects the past, that time and energy go back and forth. And due to political circumstance, family separation, particularly child separation, rose to the fore of the public imagination in 2020. Aimee, did you anticipate this cultural moment? Like, why did you write about this? I mean, why?
Well, I think somebody else said there's nothing new under the sun. I think this cultural moment is a reflection and a product of so many others that have happened throughout time. It seems particularly grim, I will admit, and particularly overwhelming, but in part that is our national POV because we haven't seen anything like this before, but in other continents, it happens all the time. The story that I wrote began with a dream that I had back in 2003, and I'm not sure exactly, but I believe that that's a period of time when Sierra Leone and Liberia and a number of other countries in Africa were experiencing explosive hemorrhages of people and refugees. And of course, that's something that happens throughout much of the world all the time, and we are not privy to it in the same way we are currently in this country with the border issue. But it's also something, of course, that happens with every war, and families are divided. And as I said earlier, these are the stories that often don't get told. But that was, I think, the genesis for me was perhaps what was happening in the zeitgeist at that moment, which came percolating up in a dream about the young girl in my book who is so attached. She's an orphan, and she's so attached to this little boy that she takes care of that she hides him and disappears with him in the middle of an evacuation, and then, comes wandering out and with the revelation of, what have I done? So all of the characters in my book really are coming face to face with the horrors of war with a combination of incredulity and guilt, because war is not something that you can imagine in advance. You can't prepare for it. You can't think that what you do ordinarily in your daily life, which doesn't really have much consequence, will then have totally fatal consequences for many, many people. And that's one of the aspects of war, I think, and separation that we can't wrap our heads around, especially in this country. And so that's something that I think we maybe need to start thinking more about, is not taking so much for granted in our daily lives, because some of what we do in our daily lives is about to start having consequences that we may not be able to imagine. So,
I can feel that. I have a sense of rising dread, which I think is something that is shared. And although the buildup toward conflict is experienced individually as suffering, I think that writers, we tend to a collective memory that is often erased by the rhetoric of communicators who were being paid to further institutional intentions. But Ellen, your extended family suffered extreme consequences of the misjudgment, the news media, and court systems. And could you talk about their case and how it influenced your framing of her sister's tattoo?
Yes, the issue of children separated from family because of political incarceration comes very close to home for me. When my husband, Robbie, was 3 years old and his brother, Michael, was 7, their parents were arrested. Over the next 3 years, their parents, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, were tried, convicted, and sentenced to execution. During those years, the boys were only able to see their parents on prison visits to Sing Sing. Ethel and Julius's siblings were so, reasonably so, frightened of McCarthy's Cold War period that they did not take the boys into their home. So these 2 little boys were shuffled from a children's shelter to a grandmother and then to foster care. So for 3 years, they only saw their parents in prison. I wasn't consciously thinking about those 1950s Sing Sing visits when I wrote the prison scenes in this novel. But hearing my husband and his brother talk about those visits and reading Ethel and Julius's death house letters to each other and to their sons deeply affected me. Robbie and Michael recall the visits as being really emotionally safe, that their parents made them as ordinary as possible, talking about school and hobbies, sharing the insects they had captured from their cells. Ironically, these prison visits were a safe haven in the middle of a nightmare. In my novel, nobody perjured themselves. In real life, Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, lied during the trial about his sister's involvement, thereby sealing her fate. Later on 60 Minutes, he admitted that he lied in order to save his wife from being indicted. But that lie was used to pressure these parents. If they had falsely confessed, if they had named names, they probably could have prevented their sons from being orphans. Talk about impossible choices. So clearly, this situation and the execution of my in-laws and the effect of their trial and their legal lynching deeply affected this novel, although I have to admit I often wasn't aware of it when I was writing it in the way that often happens.
So it seems to me we're coming to a point in our history where we may begin to have to lay more down on the line as individuals to secure the collective future that we hope for. So given what your family suffered, what do you feel about your character's decisions to either commit to the cause and be imprisoned and separated from those that they loved, or to betray their closest blood relatives in order to have the access that they need to their child?
If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't keep writing books on this subject. I think that fiction is much better at asking those questions than answering them. We ask them, we delve as deeply as we can, we write as dramatically as we can, as truthfully as we can, and we put that into the world to be part of our general conversation about that question. I don't know the answer, and I tried to make both of these characters as authentic as I could so that their decisions up the ante in terms of our conversation. The only thing I can say is that my husband, who speaks a lot about the Rosenberg case, will often say that he would much rather be the son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg than the son of David Greenglass.
You know, one of the things that I think is so fabulous about all of these books, and really all good fiction in general, is the role that empathy plays. And Ellen, in your book, I thought you did a masterful job of not giving any easy answers, because I felt so empathetically connected to both of the sisters and the hard choices, impossible choices that they were making, and that also the people around them, their husbands, were making choices and doing things that affected the outcome. And it's a very uncomfortable book. I mean, I think all of these books are uncomfortable books because they're not easy. And they do draw the reader in so that you have acute empathy for characters in impossible situations who have to make just impossible choices. And that's really what we all need as a society. It's one of the reasons why fiction is so important, is that it does up the empathy ante, and it kind of gets the empathy juices going. And it's, let's face it, it's one of the big problems in America today, is that there is not nearly enough empathy going around. And that's why things like the situation at the border is escalating out of control, and a lot of other problems in this country are happening for lack of empathy, lack of humanity.
It may be that for that reason that the horrendous practice of separating children from their families as they try to migrate into the United States has daylighted for so many people horrors that have been suffered for decades of people trying to make a better life for themselves, or even have a life at all.
Right.
And it's been happening for so long, but it took this egregiousness of these cases of seeing these children who are put into pens and babies taken from their mothers to people to understand that this is being done in the name of American freedom.
And it is a tactic of war.
Yeah.
Make no mistake. This is something that the Nazis did. It's something that the Japanese did. It's a tactic of war right up there with rape. And we are doing it in peacetime to people who have committed no crime. It's pretty outrageous. And as a society, by and large, we've sat back and allowed it to happen.
We have a long history of it, starting with slavery and you know,
Native Americans.
taking Native American children and forcing them into schools to be separated from their culture as well as their families.
And of course, that plays into the purity of race as well. That is something that certainly in our two books has a role in terms of the tribal relations. And
well, in the use of by the colonizing forces to use these notions to divide communities that had been living in harmony in their miscegenation and with surrounding peoples for a very long time prior to contact. But you know, it's interesting because the trauma is so immediate, and yet it's also intergenerational, because there is an enormous effect of the children who have suffered through the separation. And so I was wondering, you have this discussion of the relationship between emotional resilience and attachment. And I was actually thinking about your husband, how amazing it is that you have kept a long-term loving relationship despite what he went through, which would make it very difficult to commit and and fully show up within an emotionally intimate relationship. So discussing that relationship between emotional resilience and attachment, especially in the context of violent separation, what kind of research did you do into that to write Glorious Boy? And how did you find that the spirit survives that kind of brutal primal loss.
Well, I think one of the ingredients in this book was deep thought about attachment, and I've written, in my other life, I write nonfiction, and so I've written several books on infant development and attachment and early childhood relationships, and I personally have had a very fraught relationship with my own mother over the years, where attachment is kind of dicey, and I think it goes way, way back to the beginning. And so part of it, what I was exploring was that notion of when early attachment between a parent and a child doesn't go right, then it kind of opens a Pandora's box to all kinds of other rifts and fractures in the family fabric, and then obviously in a situation where it's a crisis, then you have other problems that follow. So I was looking very closely at that. I've also thought that attachment can be a double-edged sword sometimes, when the attachment is so strong and so close that when it's broken, when a crisis happens and there's a loss, the survivor simply falls apart and dissolves. And so one of the things that I was looking at in this book, and part of the way I was looking at it was looking at couples and families who survived the loss of children, who survived the loss of beloved partners. This is a universal challenge, was to think about what makes the difference between someone who dissolves in grief and someone who picks up and uses grief as as a catalyst for positive change. And it came down, there's a section in the book that addresses this, when Claire, the main character, discovers that the Japanese have invaded, and she's on the verge of completely dissolving and falling apart, and she meets a doctor who, in India, doctors are faced with overwhelming loss, grief, tragedy, everywhere, and the phrase comes to her, "One does what one can." And it's that idea of being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And if you just dissolve in grief, you become part of the problem. Let's face it, you're not helping anything. You're not helping with the memory of your child. And we have examples of this all around us. I mean, the Parkland shooting, all of these school shootings, and you've got parents, particularly from Connecticut, the people who lost, kindergartners. What do? Do they dissolve in grief, or do they pick up and try and do something in their child's honor to make it worth something? A lot of that has to do with character and personality, but a lot of it has to do also with just wanting to make some positive change out of the worst possible thing that can happen. And again, I can't say that there's any prescription for this. You can't say, well, if you just do X, Y, and Z, you'll be able to be resilient. But it's, it's a cauldron of choices that one needs to make when the unimaginable happens. And, we all have to face these thresholds at different times in our lives in different ways.
I've been so impressed by the students who have banded together using social media to create a collective action in response to the loss and the permanent separation from their communities of their fallen classmates who were murdered by gun violence. And it does seem to me that although we are in the process of deferring a national healing, that we will need to, as a collective, address the long-term trauma to these peoples who have been separated at early times from their families, and find a way to support them and give a way for them to implement their learned experience into further policy. We need to provide support. It's so much to ask of someone who has suffered individualized and also systemic violence to then dust themselves off and change the nation. That's something that we together need to do. And I wonder, as you follow your sisters and her sister's tattoo, they seem to kind of move in and out of finding their purpose. And that's one of the beauties of age, is it teaches us endurance, and it teaches us how to come back to our purpose. But I wonder how both your characters and those that you know in your life have continually kind of rehomed into their purpose.
Well, the sisters take very different paths, but I became interested in the way that those choices and the consequences of them are passed on to the next generation, both because I'm very interested in how we pass our values to younger people, and how younger people either take them up or don't. So Esther does not share this history with her daughter. It's a secret in their family, what happened. Molly doesn't even know that she has an aunt who's in prison. Rosa does not keep secrets, and her activism is open, and her daughter is the one who sort of takes over the novel in the second half. And I think that her experience growing up knowing what happened to the sisters, understanding the family story, is in many ways a healthier one. And when she meets her cousin for the first time and shares this story, I think it's an important part of the book. It's an important way for the shared family history to begin some sort of healing for all of the family members.
Yeah, silence is no protection.
Not
I've
a
learned
bit.
that well in my life. And it's one of the reasons why we're here, to disrupt that silence with our stories. So I feel like now might be a good time to open up to audience questions, although I have a few more in the hopper. And I don't know if y'all who are listening via the live stream have sent any in, but I see someone with a mic over there.
You have a question they want to start with?
Thank you for being here. We appreciate you.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you so much for your lovely comments. I guess my question is, when we're writing about big topics such as this, there undoubtedly needs to be a level of sensitivity, and something that I'm interested in as a writer is generational trauma, specifically concerning the Korean War and adoptees. And in some ways it feels like my story, and in a lot of ways it doesn't. And especially with the controversy with American Dirt right now, I think a lot of people are wondering, how do we ethically write fiction, considering the realm of the imagination and possibility, which is a big part of fiction, while also knowing what story is ours and what story isn't. And if you just have any advice for a writer trying to write a story as complicated as, a story about war.
Thank you. Would you like to start?
Why don't you start, for a change?
So, for me, fiction writing occasions a deep reckoning. And the first deep reckoning that must be had is within the self. And in that essay by James Baldwin that I continuously refer to because I pull it out and read it whenever I feel like I'm losing strength, he says that the face one cannot see is one's own face, but that your enemy, your brother, your lover sees that face, and it elicits the most extraordinary reactions. And so, for me, it's not possible to have a literature that reflects our polyglot, multicultural world while remaining within one perspective. To do so would be akin to casting a film and only giving the central character, a speech. To me, the interiority of fiction is the predication of the thoughts and feelings and hopes of other peoples as valid sites of inquiry and learning. And when I think about the controversy around American Dirt, I think that what the author failed to do was have that deep reckoning before beginning to write. And that requires years of research. It requires true engagement with the communities in which the story is based. From a craft perspective, I find it very helpful, if ever stymied in writing a scene, to write the scene from the perspective of another person who's involved in the scene. And whether or not that comes into the text, what it does allow for is authorly understanding of the complex motivations which cannot be simplified to be marketed in the way that that book was marketed. And to the extent that fiction remains a great project, and I think that it does, we should be careful to be good stewards of the stories that we tell, but to foreclose any other kind of fiction but autofiction would be, I think, to impede upon the project that James Baldwin himself calls for, which is the long look backwards. And he said that it's the responsibility of the artist to be at war with one society, and that war is always a lover's war, for it reveals the face that one did not want to see, and with that revelation makes freedom real. And even if the project of fiction only reveals the author's face to herself, I think in that process, watching as a reader an author go through that on the page, through the juxtaposition with other characters, can be very worthwhile. But I, at the same time, do feel that the interiority of other lives is the greatest font of inspiration and exploration that is available to a fiction writer. And I was very grateful, actually, to Zadie Smith for her recent essay in defense of fiction in the New York Review of Books. Because in it, I mean, she came to talk at Seattle Arts and Lectures recently, and she was talking about these subcultures within Japan who were imitating Chicanos, and they dressed that way, and they loved the things that they loved, and she adored them. And she'd say, what do I do with this adoration? Where do I put it? And in the essay that she wrote for the New York Review of Books, she borrowed a phrase from Emily Dickinson: does your grief weigh the same as mine? And how can we begin to take that measure if we do not make the attempt first to see the eyes, through the eyes of others, and see perhaps ourselves for the first time?
That was beautiful.
Oh.
Yeah, nothing to add.
Thank you for your question. Do you have other questions in the audience?
Thanks so much. Those were wonderful readings. I think so often when we think of the issue of family separation, at least in the ways that your three books are articulating them, the villain in that story is the state or war or systemic oppression. But I noticed that in each of your narratives, there's also an interpersonal betrayal. And I was just wondering if there is a relationship that you can articulate between interpersonal betrayal and those larger forces that lead to family separation.
I would say yes. I mean, what is war but betrayal and jealousy and power struggles writ large? But of course that starts in our one-to-one interactions with each other. And I guess that's kind of what I was referring to when I was talking about the things we take for granted that we do every day. Microaggressions being one very small but very large example. For centuries, we've developed a pattern of these microaggressions. We've taken them for granted in the culture. We've refused, at least on certain sides of the culture, refused to look at the impact it's having on the other side. And now it's bubbling up to the surface and taking on other dimensions. And in some places, some places it's the kind of thing that sparks rebellions and revolts and war, civil war, certainly. So yes, I think that for me it was very important to look at kind of the pain, the interpersonal pain and conflict, specifically that was spawned in my story by colonial behavior. And there's a lot of damage in my book before my characters even arrive on the Andaman Islands that's done by the British since the 1700s in that part of the world. And I think that it ties into another issue that I get there, which has to do with this idea of rescue and responsibility and conflict and patriarchy. There was a phrase that the Brits often used in the colonies: "We are their mother and their father," which was like, we're the parents of these poor little brown people, you know, and we're going to solve their problems, and they shouldn't ever have any conflict with us because we have their best interests at heart. And that kind of attitude then generates all sorts of interpersonal conflicts that bubble throughout the society and that eventually well up and cause war. So I think it's almost impossible to separate. It's just a continuum from the individual to the larger political issues.
And often, I mean, in my family's, we came from Cuba, and I went back there to do research on sex workers. And what was amazing to me, I was living in the home of a family where the father was the head of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And those were, they called CRR, and they were kind of dispersed networks of prescribed betrayal, where neighbors would turn upon neighbor and tell their secrets, reveal who had visited their home when, and the individuals became agents of the state oppression. And of course, in so much history with the deportation of, and then incarceration and execution of Jewish people, many of their neighbors were the ones who revealed their location and what they had and where it was. And so the face of the systemic oppression often does take the form of a neighbor or a family member who, for their own reasons, are trying to save their own lives and betray. And to the extent that it is difficult, I mean, I'm a reporter, right? So many reporters and storytellers will choose an individual through which to tell, an interlocutor, to tell a story of systemic oppression. But it's without that portal into the system, it can be very difficult to show how the mechanisms work. That's one of the reasons why, for example, going back to like an older book, Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, you see so much the attenuation of individual responsibility within the bureaucracy. But the bureaucracy, because people say, well, it's not me, it's the party, or it's not me, it's this institution, and yet the pressures of that system come to bear and make of that individual a subjective wielder of that systemic oppression. And I think for that reason, interpersonal politics and dynamics come into play so much in novels that deal with historical oppression.
And let's face it, in writing fiction, if we focus only on the big picture, we run the very real risk of being didactic.
Yeah.
And by focusing on the conflict on an interpersonal level, we're able to, through the eyes and the skin and the feelings of our characters, get at that same big picture, but in a way that a reader responds to much more directly. And I think that, it's practical as well as the fact that these conflicts are mirrored, big and small.
Yeah, suffering does disappear into statistics. And even though I find them very necessary, you cannot improve what you do not measure. To find a way into understanding the systems of impossible choices that face each individual, finding a character through which to tell a story helps alleviate the burden of responsibility in some ways. Many people, when someone has gone through a horrible experience, want to blame that person as though through some kind of combination of intelligence and better learning, they could have when did their way out of the situation? And many trial lawyers, I have a dear friend who's a trial lawyer in the South, and one of the things that they do when they're trying to prove the innocence or at least the lack of guilt of an individual is walk the jury through all the choices that were or were not available to that person. And only through doing that can you trigger that empathy, which allows people to say, well, maybe this person is not at fault for what they have been through. Maybe they were the inheritor of circumstances that were impossible. But only by putting the series of choices into an array that you are able to work your way through, is it possible to have people who've already decided upon the guilt of that person change their minds. In a lot of ways, as fiction writers, we're trying to change people's minds and open their hearts. And for that reason, finding an individual interlocutor is important. So thank you for that question.
I have one question from the ether, from Deborah on Twitter. The question is actually directed towards Aimee. Why did you decide to use the device of the mother being misunderstood by the nanny to add confusion to the separation of mother and child?
Well, I think this is something that a lot of people are dealing with childcare. So it's a first world today issue as well as something that goes far back. I can't exactly tell you why, but this particular dynamic struggle seems to be deep in my psyche. And I think it has something to do with my own relationship with my mother. It probably also has to do with the fact that when I was very young, when I was 3 to 5, exactly the age of the character in my book, I lived in India, and I was raised by ayahs at that time. My mother was off doing a range of other noble works. But I seem to have come all of these years still with this kind of tension between, that attachment to tension with my mother versus the other people who cared for me at that time of my life. And it's something that all working women, working mothers deal with, that, they're off however many hours a day doing their job, and someone else is at home with their young child, bonding with the child. And then anytime you've had the experience of losing a caregiver who the child has become very attached to, it's a traumatic loss. So it's on a personal level, I think it's a very fraught and interesting dynamic that is ripe for fiction. In dealing with the colonial issue, that is the context of the book, and the issues of war, I found it even that much more powerful to go into this particular arena, because in so many of these societies, colonial societies, but also other areas where there's a lot of cultural mixing at one point, and then the cultures are ripped to get apart. Think of Sarajevo during the war, where the Muslims and the Christians and everybody had been intermarrying, and it was a completely blended society, and then all of a sudden they were ripped apart. Or India during a partition, where you'd had Hindus and Muslims living side by side, getting along, and now at this, somebody rings a bell and all of a sudden they're machine gunning each other at the corner. What do people do in those situations? So I thought, again, to take the political and make it as privately personal as possible, to take a small family where this is the cauldron of what's happening would be incredibly powerful. And as I say, my book began with a dream. And that dream was a dream about jealousy over this small child. And I can't explain my psyche and why it came up. But that was the seed for that story. It was one of those dreams that wakes you up in the middle of the night. You have to write it down, and you've got the basis for a book. And, it took me 17 years to get this book out into the world, but that dream never quit. So
And the project of fiction as well is not to allow for an easy interpretation of a situation. We, as you were saying before, Ellen, we seed complexities as countercurrents into situations to ask and compel our readers to think through the characters. If we've already done that thinking for them and foreclosed the possibility of reimagining what could have happened if something differently had been thought or said, then we have removed the basic tool of fiction. So to me, making sure that there are countercurrents within every single situational interpersonal dynamic within a novel is critical to triggering that, that thoughtfulness so that it's not an easy condemnation, you know, or an easy acquiescence to where the novel is leading. Everyone is struggling against the inevitability of what happens, which becomes a function of their characters interacting with the system and with each other. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my question was for Ellen. I just wondered, I wrote a little bit about...
A little louder,
oh,
please.
sorry, louder. My accent doesn't help either. I just wondered a little bit about when you're writing towards like themes of incarceration and that sort of thing. How did you go about your research? Did you rely on some of your husband's experiences to kind of inform the concept of prison? Or did you go to the extent of going into prisons or speaking with former inmates or anything like that?
You know, I've lived with this family story since I was 19. So the idea of research is partly thinking about all of the things that I heard, and speaking some with my husband about it. But I also, let me back up a little. My husband's response to his situation was to start a public foundation called the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which gives grants to kids today whose parents have been targeted for their progressive political activity. And as a board member of that organization for 30 years, I've had the honor and opportunity to hear many stories of families that have gone through political targeting, many of whom end up in prison, some of whom end up murdered, all of whom end up really traumatized by the responses of the state or of individuals to their activism. So I've heard these stories for many years. I also have a number of friends who have either been incarcerated or have had family members, and I had the ability to pick their brains about what it's like both to be in prison and to be in a visiting room. Yeah, that scene I read, much of it comes from an interview with a friend who spent many, many Sunday visiting hours in a prison visiting room. So when you add the research and just, it's been kind of part of my life to hear these stories. I guess
I want to say thank you so much for coming here. Thank you also for committing yourself to your own projects. I know that what brings us into community is this individual hope that we too will share our stories. We would love to keep on talking. So Ellen and I are going to be at the Red Hen Press booth 1455 at 2 o'clock, and Aimee will be signing at 3. If you come by, we would be happy to answer this and any other questions that you may have about craft or the process to publication. And I want to say thank you again to Red Hen Press, who brought us here, and to AWP, who kept us going. Thank you.
Thank you.